Right. Hello. For those of you joining me and my cat, we're reading Metapsychological Relativism, a Response to White by Steve Matthews. This is a response to the article I read the last time, and so let's go. Stephen White has recently developed a position he calls metapsychological relativism. White claims that neither the current orthodoxy and accounts of personal identity as represented in Derek Parfit's reductionism nor Marquina non-reductionism as represented by Thomas Nagel provide satisfactory accounts of personal identity. The problem, says White, is that the reductionists and non-reductionists alike think the crucial dialectic divide falls between their respective positions. White's suggestion is that a mistaken presupposition underlies the debate between these positions. Is that a mistaken presupposition underlying the debate between these positions is that the puzzle case is designed to elicit our beliefs about personal identity must polarize us towards two extremes. Either survival involves a simple fact, the persistence of any alien or Cartesian subjective experiences, or it involves a complex set of facts which together provide an impersonal account of personal identity. In demonstrating this alleged mistake, White first criticizes the non-reductionist option, but then goes on to argue that the current orthodoxy of psychological reductionism will not do as a replacement, for there is a tension in reductionism itself. Within reductionism, we can describe cases which elicit unstable intuitions, and so bring us no closer to a solution to our problems, says White. The problem seems to be that the current reductionist orthodoxy has been too restricted and concerned with psychological facts only, but once we widen the range of facts we allow, for instance, including, for example, certain cultural and technological facts, the metapsychological facts, the boundaries we draw around persons will be determined by factors that cannot be fixed absolutely. Whether one survives or not won't be a matter of psychological continuity between one's different person stages. Inter alia, it will be a matter of what one's society presupposes about such things as personal identity, responsibility, and unity and character of the self. Such presuppositions differ across cultures and times, so according to White, there are no universal facts about personal identity and survival. Personal identity is a relative notion. I think this suggestion is quite mistaken, as many people do. In this paper, I present my reasons for rejecting it and criticizing it. I hope to draw out some important morals for methodology we apply in investigating questions of personal identity. Psychological reductionism. White takes Parfit's psychological reductionism as a representative of received opinion on the question of personal identity. In the present section, I describe Parfit's positive account. Parfit follows human, holding that person at a time is nothing but a collection or bundle of experiences, so his account is atomistic, and that person's existence at any time, called his person stage, just consists of those potentially detachable elements that go to make up that person's psychological life at that time. Then the problem of personal identity over time can be rephrased as follows. What would it take to unite the various person stages of life into a single person? And we have a dreaded endnote, which we will deal with in the customary manner by cursing the publisher and opening up a duplicate PDF, which we scroll to the end and zoom in a bit. Oh, I missed endnote 1. Okay, endnote number 1. Thanks to John Bigelow, Monty Machado, Alan Crook, Frank Jackson, Aubrey Townsend. So I believe she has written, she's written on no-self stuff, I think, not conventionalism. Okay, number 2. It may be thought illegitimate to talk of person stages in connection with Parfit's account, but this language is certainly not adopted in reasonable persons, but Parfit is perfectly comfortable with concepts. See, for instance, Parfit's Lewis Perry and What Matters in Rorty, 1976. This, my copy is in America. Where in footnote 3, accepting this terminology, Parfit comments that a person stages as a person during a period. Aren't we all? The answer is that it would take the right kind of psychological links. The right kinds of links are those joining person stages causally and those preserving the psychological similarities between the stages. The psychological reductionist claims that complete account of a person's existence over time can be given purely in terms of psychological continuity relation holding between a person of various stages. What do you want? That's my cat. Parfit explains his psychological continuity relation first by defining a direct psychological connection. 3 sorts of connections feature here: the direct causal connection between remembering event and the experience it recalls, the direct causal connection between intention, the action, and occasions, and finally, the direct causal connection to the whole when a belief, desire, or any other psychological feature persists in the subject. Having thus set up the notion of direct psychological connections, Parfit then defines the more general relation of psychological Connectedness, this involves the holding of particular direct psychological connections when a sufficient number of direct connections obtained. There is but perfect strong connectedness. Now, strong psychological connectedness is not a transitive relation based on the sheer quantities of direct psychological connections. I am strongly psychologically connected to myself yesterday, but not to myself 2 decades ago, even though some psychological connections remain. Since, however, there is a strong connectedness across shorter periods, there are overlapping chains of strong connectedness to times more distant. When there are these overlapping chains, there is what perfect psychological continuity. Relation R is the relation of psychological continuity, but this relation may be a one-many relation. Is relation R psychological continuity? I don't know. That a person's stage A could be R related to a later person stage B, and only B can never be guaranteed logically. Parfit demonstrates this with his branch line case, in which 2 person stages come to be R related to a single antecedent. So if one wishes to adopt relation R into a criterion of personal identity, then one must stipulate that the relation does not branch. This is what Parfit suggests. His psychological criterion of personal identity can be summed up thus. A is the same person as B if and only if A is psychologically continuous with B and B is the only causal descendant in this relation. I think Parfit's actual criterion of personal identity is the holding of enough direct psychological connections and or psychological continuity. Of course, the stipulation of non-branchingness in the psychological criterion disguises the important claim that it's relation R and not identity that matters in survival, internal and external relations. Before proceeding, we need to put in place a distinction. Note that what follows are preliminary remarks only to give a flavor to the distinction I have in mind. I shall return to it in section 5.4. Theorists in the philosophy of personal identity draw on data that are either internal or external to persons. There are many difficulties associated with making the internal-external distinction. Let me circumvent these difficulties by stipulating that under a rubric of the relations that are important to personal identity or survival. This one is very confusing because it's the same font they use for endnotes. 1, a relation will count as internal if it can take its place as one or more of the component direct psychological connections in Parfit's relation R, and 2, a relation will count external otherwise. Okay. As will become clear, the issue that divides Parfit and White is over whether there are any external relations relevant to survival. Parfit's claim is that features that matter in survival are all internal. White's suggestion is that we should bring in a range of external features, metapsychological facts, and once we do this, we arrive at an account of personal identity that relativizes 2 such facts. Great. Problems with method. In philosophy, there can be no greater tragedy than the murder of a beautiful theory by a gang of brutal facts, a line attributed to Herbert Spencer. And so it is with theorizing on personal identity, except that the facts are more often than not attended by fictions, at least of a sort, the so-called puzzle cases. It's a feature of the literature on personal identity that theories are quickly seized upon for their inability to accommodate a certain response to an example, real or imagined. We can be coaxed effortlessly to respond to certain cases only if we believe, for example, in the possibility that a person should swap bodies with another. Similarly, we can be persuaded to believe that a person has survived an ordeal in which there is a complete dislocation in psychological continuity. Indeed, as Bernard Williams has demonstrated, we can be seduced into these responses, the particular ones just mentioned, even with respect to the same case, though differently described. White claims that we can be won over to them, even with a purely reductionist framework, one that rejects the suggestion that personal identity is a further fact beyond the facts pertaining to our metaphysical existence. Let me now restate the 2 presentations from Williams. Not a restatement so far. Presentation 1, body swapping. Suppose there's a machine that records and stores information from a person's brain, and indeed suppose it can store all the information required for those aspects of mental function that are necessary for a person's survival. Suppose that the machine can not only extract and park information from a person's brain, it can re-enter this information into an information-free brain of another person. Hence, 2 people may enter the machine after undergoing the process of extraction and re-entry may appear for all the world as if they have just swapped bodies. And indeed, they may well have done just that. Suppose then that this happened. 2 persons, A in the A body and B in the B body, enter the machine. Upon emerging, it will appear that to a bystander that B now occupies the A body, and vice versa. Evidence for this may come from 2 sources. First, the A body person will now behave in ways similar to the ways of the B body person prior to its entry into the machine, and vice versa. For example, the A body person of the process may now be left-handed, whereas before the A body person was right-handed. Second, certain first-person reports may suggest the claim that there's been a body switch. Take, for example, the memory claims of the participants. The person in the B body may claim to remember doing things that we know were done using the A body before the process. To push the body swapping hypothesis a little further, we can imagine that before entering into the machine, A is told the following: after the process of brain information swap, $100,000 is going to give to one of the subjects, while the other is going to be tortured. A is then asked to decide on selfish grounds which of the A body person and the B body person she desires should be tortured and which she desires should receive the money. We may suppose that A chooses the person occupying the A body after the process as the person to be tortured. Her grounds for choosing so are based on the hypothesis of body swapping. Presentation 2, mental tampering and torture. Suppose you are told that after undergoing some radical psychological changes, you will be tortured. Suppose, however, that you are told of things that could happen to you in a series of installments. After each installment, you're asked to reflect on whether, given the additional information at each of the stages, you have a reason to fear what will happen. The installments run as followed. 1. Prior to being tortured, all your memories are to be removed. 2. All your memories are to be removed, and all the other psychological features are to be replaced with a bogus set. You'll be given amnesia together with a different and fictitious character. 3. All your memories are replaced with apparent memories that relate to no one's experiences, and you'll be given a different set of character traits. 4. What happens is the same as in 3, except the character traits and apparent memories induced in you will match those of some other actual person B. 5. The same as in 4, but the character traits from the apparent memories will be copied from your brain into your brain from the brain of B. 6. The same thing happens to you as in 5, but it also happens that your apparent memories and character traits replace those which were in the brain of B. We may add that after all this, the B-body person will receive $100,000. As you follow each of the steps, knowing after the process you are to be tortured, do you have grounds for fear? It seems you do. You seem quite easily to be able to make sense of the claim that after each psychological change, it will be you who will feel the pain and the torture. The psychological state that you will be in does not seem to exclude your being in pain. In particular, if you agree that you have grounds for fear at step 5, then surely you have no grounds for changing your minds at step 6. The description of what happens at step 6 involves no change to you, but involves a change to another person. It seems to make little difference also that this other individual is to receive $100,000. This last point reflects the principle that a criterion of personal identity should not include as relevant any facts about persons other than the person whose survival is in question. Call this Williams' principle. We've got Williams' principle in here somewhere. So we might as well make a note that this person is talking about it. Beautiful. When presented with the case in the second way, one's fear at the prospect of what will happen is grounded on the assumption that the personal identity goes with the body, not with the psychology. The trouble for the theorist comes from the fact that this is a presentation of the very same case to which we earlier responded in presentation 1 on the assumption that personal identity goes with the psychology of the person, not the body. We come to 2 different conclusions in response to the same case, albeit in different ways. Following Johnson 1977, I will relate with the fact that we arrive at these contrary conclusions. Williams' conundrum, or simply the conundrum. Charlie Johnston could not have called it Williams' conundrum. In this paper, I am not directly interested in the argument for bodily continuity view of personal identity that Williams runs in response to the conundrum. However, before getting to the main business, I should like to make some remarks in response to Williams on this issue. Williams' own response to the conundrum is to reject the body-swapping hypothesis, though he does it with less than full conviction. Briefly, he regards the neatness of the body-swapping hypothesis as basically artificial, and the principle underlying one's intuitions in presentation 2 is more straightforward. This is the principle that one's fears can extend to future pain whenever psychological changes precede it. My own response to the conundrum is to deny this principle. The right response to the second presentation is to draw the line at step 2. Once amnesia is produced, all of one's character traits are changed, then psychologically there's nothing left to the person. So once the point has been reached, there cease to be grounds for fearing what will happen to that person. Someone who thinks that there are grounds, they're not making a conceptual mistake. We can make sense of why someone might fear it to happen. What's to happen is nonetheless mistaken their judgment about the grounds of fear. Now, of course, others simply do not share this intuition. There may be no way to persuade them, so though I do not come to contrary conclusions given the 2 presentations, it's still a fact that others do, or at least that others respond to presentation 2 in the way assumed by Williams. It may be enough for his argument that the conundrum arises in this way. But even if we accept the premise of Williams' argument that we do indeed come to contrary conclusions relative to the different descriptions of the same case, we should note a certain limitation to the argument. It doesn't generalize. A quadriplegic, or at least a person unable to experience any bodily pain, will not be persuaded by the argument at all. And that should tell us something important. The intuition guiding presentation 2 is this: to remain fearful about what's to happen to you, given knowledge about how you are going to be changed beforehand, makes sense only if the fear is grounded in the belief that it's you who will suffer future bodily pain. If we were to extrapolate from this case to a principle that covers a broad range of egoistic fears, then we may offer formulations such as this: rationally based fears had by A for person B presuppose that A is B. But does this more general principle cover all fears that would be listed, given what happens in presentation 2? What intuitions are generated by the presentation if we replace the fear of bodily pain with, for example, the fear of public ridicule? Suppose you're a world-famous chess player who's playing in a tournament tomorrow, but you're kidnapped. You're told you're to undergo the psychological changes outlined in presentation 2, and that you're to be given the chess skills of a novice player, along with other changes. I think I want to put this in Hypernomicon. I think to do that what we need is a bodily theory of personal identity, which is maybe these will be physical. And Williams is sort of unclear whether he's a bodily theorist or a brain theorist, like whether he's an animalist or a brain theorist, and so it's not really clear what sort of subdivision of this he'd fit into, so we'll just make an argument for this in Williams. And now we have a counterexample, or counter-argument to this, but we'll finish reading it before we put it in Hypernomicon. When tomorrow comes, those mediocre chess skills will be paraded in front of the chess world. In this case, since all the suffering is psychological suffering, a rational response ought to be that you will have no fear at all in the sense of anticipating from the inside what will happen tomorrow when the person occupying the body you presently occupy is shoved into the limelight and then humiliated. The person tomorrow will not believe that he is you. Of course, the knowledge that you will be thought foolish by other persons may be a concern to you, but this is not the type of fear that's supposed to be important here. So the fear of psychological suffering will not generate the response required for the contrary conclusion, and no conundrum results if this is the kind of fear we have in mind in the thought experiment. What this shows is that the general principle formulated above, principle that rationally based fears had by A for person B presuppose that A is B, is not supported by Williams' example. I don't think that follows, because this is a lack of fear, but the general principle is about fear, and so if you don't have any fear, there's nothing, you don't have a counterexample to the principle, you just have something that fails to confirm the principle. But maybe the thought is that really this ought to confirm the principle. Whatever, we're putting the argument in. So the fear of psychological suffering will not generate the response required for the contrary conclusion, and no conundrum results. The contrary conclusion. The contrary conclusion being when we describe it in sort of presentation 2, you're scared all of a sudden. So again, I'm not sure by the argument, but that's good enough for us right now. Let me now return to the central issue. I should point out that White too is not directly interested in Williams' argument. The issue raised by the conundrum for White is Rather, this puzzle cases like Williams and others show that our intuitions are unstable even within a reductionist framework. This instability results from our focusing on different features of the relation of personal identity in the following way. In the first presentation of Williams' case, we're prepared to accept the hypothesis about body swapping because we're drawn to consider the internal feature of the relation as described. In the second feature, we are led to the conclusion that survival goes with an external feature of the body, largely due to the use of first-person language, a point that will become important later. This leads me to a central concern of this paper. On the assumption that there is a yes or no question, the answer to the question who survives in Williams' case, how do we explain away the conflicting intuitions raised by the conundrum? Even Parfidians, who hold that there may be cases where the answer to the question about survival may be indeterminate, should think that in this case the answer is an all or nothing, since there is a fact of the matter, and that either A survives the A-body person or that A survives the B-body person. I mean, I don't know, they could deny it, but whatever. White argues that since Parfit and psychological reductions generally privilege the internal perceptive, they have no explanations for intuitions about presentation 2 of the case. Or looking at it another way, White claims that if psychological reductionism is right, we ought to have the same reaction to both presentations of the case, yet clearly we do not. This should be a superscript. At least White and Williams claims that we do not have, as I said, my intuitions diverge. There's also some anecdotal evidence in encounters with students of intuitions that are at odds with this claim, but as remarked earlier, it may be enough for the argument that some significant number of people do have the intuitions the case is designed to elicit. What we must do in response to Williams' conundrum, says White, is broaden the range of criteria we allow to include what he calls non-autonomous access relations. These are, with qualifications to come, the external relations that include such things as the legal title of a person at different times, social and legal relations, contractual rights and obligations of a person at different times, and certain technological capacities facilitating or supporting survival. For example, the possession of the teletransported departure booth and its relation to a receiver booth, the kind of traveling machine used in the beaming sequences in Star Trek canon. Now, if we include such relations as these, says White, what this leads to is metapsychological relativism. The relativist claim is that there could be two societies, neither of whose members are either misinformed or irrational, but whose practices settle the significant metapsychological issues in radically different ways. It is, of course, obvious that there are cross-cultural and cross-temporal differences in certain conventions and technological capabilities, but what I shall argue is that the differences make a difference to one's survival only in the most trivial and obvious way. If White's suggestion is that there is a deep conceptual relativism here, then I shall claim that he has mistaken it for the trivial sense to be outlined. In what remains, I shall summarize White's argument and then respond to it in the sections that follow. White's case for relativism. White begins by describing a number of cases, including Williams, in order to demonstrate both how unstable our intuitions are and how the reductionist apparently fails to explain this instability. For instance, for example, in Williams' case, the psychological reductionist might well agree that A and B have swapped bodies, as suggested in presentation 1 of the case, yet from the reductionist perspective, says Williams, it would be difficult even to understand presentation 2 of the case, so that you will lose your memories and receive a different personality, and that you will be tortured is to assume tacitly that there is something beyond these psychological features which remains and which constitutes you. It sounds like he thinks that White thinks that this is begging the question, but I thought White thought it didn't beg the question. White claims that presentation 2 of this case is thus incoherent from the perspective of the psychological reductionist. Maybe that's the difference. That doesn't make it begging the question, but whatever. Yet, as Williams himself has pointed out, pre-theoretically, presentation 2 does make sense. We do seem to be able to follow it step for step with intelligibility. It's worth pausing here to note an oversight by White that will be important later. I don't find presentation 2 incoherent, as he puts it. I just think that someone who responded to it by accepting that there were grounds for fear beyond step 2 would be making an erroneous judgment in relation to the imagined facts of the situation. It sounds like begging the question. Presentation 2 would be incoherent according to the reductionist if the reductionist thought that necessarily there are no such thing as subjective experiences, an entity for whom it would make sense to strip away all psychological dispositions yet have something left over that might then experience pain. Reductionists who support a bundle theory do not, to my knowledge, reject the logical possibility that there might have been subjects of experience. Presentation 2 makes sense only if one accepts this as a possibility. Since psychological reductionists reject the suggestion that this possibility obtains in actuality, they may claim that there are no grounds for fear in this case, but that there might have been. Parfit writes at length about how a non-reductionist view might have been true. He says the best known version of the non-reductionist view, which claims that we are Cartesian egos, may make sense if the facts had been different. There might have been sufficient evidence to justify belief in this view. Now, there is a view, arguably going back to Locke and made explicit in Parfit, that the only kind of relation we rationally should care about is the psychological continuity relation. Someone who holds this view might accept the metaphysical possibility that from time to time the Cartesian entity occupying one person's body might come to occupy another body, but since the swapping of these entities would have no detectable psychological effects, there's no reason for rationally caring about what has happened. This view might be applied to Williams' case. The reductions might accept the metaphysical possibility that personal identity is maintained in the body despite a complete psychological replacement for that body, but simply deny that the person occupying the body before the replacement are made has rational grounds for caring about that person occupying it after the replacement. So this is the division between, or this is the question about whether personal identity is relevant for practical purposes. But, so I don't understand this but the reductionist can certainly make sense of the situation despite White's claims. White claims that reductionists such as Parfit lack the theoretical resources to account for the discrepancy in alternative response to Williams' case. It should be mentioned that White introduces other puzzle cases to make a similar point. I have phrase of exposition and I shall limit myself to Williams' case and other cases only if they serve to demonstrate a point. The problem, according to White, is that for the reductionist, survival relations supervene on a set of impersonal facts of a very specific kind. Vidlicet. Those facts associated with, as Parfit puts it, the existence of brain and body, together with facts about the occurrence of a series of interrelated physical and mental events. The narrowness of the supervenience base means that the reductionist account of survival is restricted to the internal features of the relation as I've described them. In response, White says, suppose the assumption that only internal features are relevant turns out to be wrong. In such a case, the following strategy would be possible. We could explain the difference in our responses to cases equivalent on Parfit's view, that is Williams' case, by reference to differences in the relations between person stages that are not found among internal axis relations. The devil has infiltrated this paper. On the view, I shall suggest the relations between person stages relevant to survival would include both internal and external relations. Now, White takes some trouble over his explanation of the distinction between internal and external relations, though I've indicated already how I'm taking the distinction. Are we moving on from this? I guess it's not really worth, well, I said it the last time, I'll say it this time. It never hurts to put more stuff into Hibernomicon. Cool. White separates an internal from an external relation, or what separates an internal relation from an external relation, says White is the mode of access. There are two modes of access that may play a related psychological event or action of one person stage of the psychological event or action of another. An autonomous mode of action relates such events or actions if it's possessed by all possible functionally normal adults. On the other hand, we can imagine a society that has the technological capacity to manipulate memory implants in such a way that on a given occasion a person's stage accesses the stage of another person's body only because of what some scientist does. In such a case, the person's stage is control over the remembering person compromised, the memory access in such a case White deems non-autonomous. I didn't mention this when I was reading the previous paper, but I think like everything's going to be non-autonomous. I think it's just the easier way of understanding it. Not easier, more accurate. The notion of autonomy is explained metaphorically with reference to the notion of access we have to government policy. In this context, government access is a function of our knowledge of the workings of government and our capacity to exercise control over those in power. So I take it that some person stage has autonomous access to the actions or psychological events of another person stage, in the sense that the exercise of control through intention or the access to self-knowledge through memory may be carried out as an activity that depends on normal adult functioning. It should be added here that it is very restrictive of White to require normal adult functioning to mediate the autonomous relations. Yes. White allows that there might be, for example, possible worlds where the use of teletransportation does not rule out autonomous modes of access between the person stages that engage in such travels. In such worlds, he suggests it would be the intentions and memories resulting from our normal functional makeup that would account for the access between the person stage on Earth and the replica of that person stage emerging from the booth on Mars. Yet the access between the two person stages is not completely independent of the technology, nor is it independent of what other people do. So teletransportation is a case that exhibits both autonomous and non-autonomous relations. The internal-external distinction, as discussed in section 5.3, is orthogonal to the autonomous-non-autonomous distinction. It's not the case that the internal and autonomous axis relation are necessarily coextensive, since it's not necessarily a requirement that an internal relation be mediated by the brain of a functionally normal adult. Nor is the case that the external and non-autonomous action relations are necessarily coextensive. An external relation might well be mediated autonomously. I might, for instance, keep a diary of past experiences to make up for bad memory. However, though these two distinctions are orthogonal, it's nonetheless true that for the most part, perhaps all actual cases of an internal relation will count as an autonomous action relation. The reason for this is that I'm defining an internal relation in terms of relation R, which in all actual cases we know of is mediated by human beings with normal function. This normal function stuff is just completely bad, but external relations, on the other hand, will in general count as non-autonomous access relations in actuality, though it is more likely that in practice these two relations will come apart than in the case of internal autonomous cases. For instance, it's not uncommon for people to keep diaries, and I take it that this involves personal knowledge and the control of the individual, that it helps to maintain personal identity in a way memory does. That's not a psychological internal connection. Returning now to White's argument, his strategy is clear enough. As he states it, the solution to the problems for Parfit, namely his apparent inability to explain the instability of our intuitive response to puzzle cases like Williams, turns on the existence of modes of access that are non-autonomous. That claim will be that the reference to differences in non-autonomous access relations can explain differences in our responses to examples that are equivalent where autonomous access relations are concerned. White's claim is that because the non-autonomous access relations are indispensable to our explanation of the instability in response to the puzzle cases, such relations must take their place as part of the criteria of personal identity. This leads him to adopt a form of reductionism he calls weak reductionism, according to which the facts as to whether person B is the same person existing at a later time as person A is the survivor of A supervenes on impersonal facts. According to the weak reductionist, the supervenience base we should use for fixing facts about personal identity is wider than Parfit's. It will include not only those impersonal facts associated with the existence of a brain and body, together with facts about the occurrence of a series of interrelated physical and mental events, but the impersonal facts associated with all the non-autonomous access relations as well. These are external to relation R and independent of it. White and I divide over which to count as an external relation. The account I favor would have it that the external relation is that and that only which tracks an internal relation by appeal to our best approximation in the philosophy of mind as to what counts as mediating in a memory experience link, intention action link, persisting belief, or whatever. Don't know about that. Not surprisingly, White thinks that the external relations may be associated with such non-metaphysical affairs as moral responsibility, legal titles, certain practical relations, and social conventions. By allowing these, White is driven to make his relativist claims as outlined earlier. In the section to follow, I begin my critique of this view. As we shall see, my worries stem from this disagreement concerning the appropriate external relations. Fine. Relations that matter in survival. White contrasts a number of puzzle cases besides the Williams presentations, and at this point it will be useful to introduce two more. The double transplant case, we can imagine an operation in which the main bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres of my brain, the corpus callosum, is cut. Both of the two hemispheres, which we may assume have been rendered equipolant, are then transplanted into two different bodies that are exactly similar to my own. There is, we may suppose, a degree of quality and psychological continuity between the pre-operation person stage and each of the two fission products that is more or less as good as that which would have obtained had there been no operation. According to the reductionist, the relation of survival obtains in this case despite the lack of personal identity. The multiple fission case. Imagine first a case where, like an amoeba, a person splits into two, both perfect replicas of the original. Imagine now a variation of this possibility in which the process produces a multitude of replicas, say 1,000 or even 10,000. For White's description. Okay. And now we are done with the endnotes, so we can ditch that. White claims that in both of these cases, there's a compromise in the quality of non-autonomous access between the person stage prior to the process and the person stages after it. In the double transplant case, the loss of non-autonomous action might not be crucial, but in the multiple fission case, the loss would mean the degree of access drops off to near zero. Why does White say this? An important source of knowledge about our future behavior stems from our knowledge of our future environment, the people to whom we have significant relations, the roles we play, the problems they present, and the opportunities they offer. The difficulty in the multiple fission case is that an environment so defined could never absorb the number of replicas of in person in question. People of significance to us could not maintain personal relations with each of the replicas, nor could we maintain the pattern of concern for this many future extensions which characterize our relations to our future selves. Moreover, this number of replicas would be unable to share the roles we play or the opportunities we anticipate. I take it the relativist claim enters here in the following way. In a simple double transplant case, one's environment circumstances may well absorb two replicas and the survival is still guaranteed. In the multiple fission case, since one's environment simply cannot absorb the number of replicas, survival is guaranteed to fail. This may be so despite the fact that the autonomous access relations may be the same in quality and degree in both cases. So, survival along with personal identity itself, according to White, doesn't depend on the internal relations that hold from person stage to person stage, but also what happens outside the relation. So far, so good. Now, Note that this is not only a denial of Williams' principle that the identity of person A cannot depend on what happens to another individual B, it's also a denial of the principle that Parfit supports, that survival depends only on whether two person stages are properly R-ly related. For according to to White, R may hold in one society guaranteeing the survival of person P, and it may hold in another society binding the narrow psychology of P duplicate P sub D. Yet because of what happens to others around P sub D, it does not guarantee survival in this case. To see this more clearly, imagine two possible worlds, one in which two person stages of P are properly R-related, and another world in which two person stages of P are also properly R-related. In the latter world, however, imagine there are 10,000 person stages that are also properly R-related to P sub D's pre-splitting phase. In the P world, immediately after the event of person splitting, we may suppose that the 10,000 replicas are related in the eternal sense quite properly to the earlier pre-splitting stage. Accordingly, these 10,000 replicas are equally good survivors of the earlier person stage, according to the psychological reductionist. This is because survival depends only on the internal relations being satisfied, and as they are in this case, and it's just that they are satisfied many, many times over. But the 10,000 replicas may not be equally good survivors, according to the weak reductionist, for the reasons of overcrowding given earlier. Hence, P sub D's post-splitting stage is not a survivor of his earlier person stage because of the facts about the other individuals that denies Williams' principle, and this is so despite the fact that internally his stages are properly R-related, and this denies the principle Parfit supports. Yes, correct. The problem with White's proposal is that, contrary to his claim, he has not given an account of what matters in survival in the egoistic sense that Parfit and the others have in mind. White has given us an account of what matters in survival for a range of practical, social, and moral purposes. This is surprising given that White's analysis of the phrase what matters in survival does agree with the kind of internalist gloss which Parfit might approve. Preservation of what matters might mean the preservation of what makes life worth living, but the preservation of what matters might have a stronger sense. It might mean that there are future person stages for which one would have or be justified in having the sort of special concern that one ordinarily has for one's future self. One would normally make very extreme sacrifices where one's present desires were concerned to alleviate some of the pains of a self to be tortured. In this case, in the sense in which I shall use the expression, and in which I shall assume Parfit uses it. My emphasis at the start of this quote highlights the difficulty I have with this view. The effect of bringing the non-autonomous actions relations into one's account just is to weaken the sense of what matters in survival, to include those things that make life worthwhile. Now, there is a sense in which what White says about the non-autonomous relations is correct. External conditions do matter to the way in which we survive, but egoistic survival, as I call it, might only be affected by such relations in marginal and indirect ways. Take the multiplication case. It's true that if my present self were to compete with 10,000 rivals, then each of the rivals, except perhaps one, would have to abandon the life that up to the point of fission they had been leading. Each would have to start afresh in a new social role, cultivate new friends, and so on. In other words, each would have to start afresh in a way anyone might have to, following some calamity, for example, a war that wipes out one's social supports. But starting afresh in this way is not a threat to one's survival in the egoistic sense that we're concerned with. Multiple fission would not be a threat to egoistic survival then. Rather, it would necessitate a new beginning for those involved. I think we have enough now to make the argument. This is the relevant argument, I think. And now the counter-argument. Cool, and now let's continue reading the argument. To see this even more clearly, imagine you are to be the subject of the process of multiple fission. Prior to the process, you're told that straight after each of the fission products, all 10,000 are to be tortured. Knowing that all the autonomous internal relations holding between your pre-fission stage and all the replicas are to be preserved, how should you respond to this? Take the point of view from any post-fission person stage, say PS, straight after the process. From PS's point of view, the memory-like beliefs that connect to you are as good as those that would have obtained even in the absence of all the other replicas. More of the presence of these replicas makes no difference to the pain and the torture that PS knows is about to start. Now think of again about this from the pre-fission point of view, knowing that PS's psychological condition is a condition of any post-fission stage, you ought to be disposed to make very extreme sacrifices in order to lessen the pain of the present stages to be tortured. In other words, when faced with such a scenario, the fact that there will be many rivals in survival does not eliminate one's fears and concerns about what is to be happen. And it's these fears and concerns that White himself agrees are relevant to gaining a handle on the notion of what matters in survival. I wonder if I sort of get the sense that White's concerns here are like, care about 1,000 people? How do I do that? And it's sort of similar to like these animals that have 1,000 babies and just hope that some of the babies survive, like salmon or whatever. Okay. Problems for metapsychological relativism. Returning to Williams's case, White would argue that the weak reductionist is equipped to explain away our intuitive responses to two presentations more clearly than the psychological reductionist is. In the second presentation, the use of first-person language is deployed to encourage sympathy for the view that bodily continuity is sufficient for personal identity. Such language is perhaps question-begging in the circumstances, but then so is the language of body swapping. I should not pursue such worries. The point of using first-person language from White's perspective is that it reflects the everyday practice we have of identifying and re-identifying bodies on the basis of our identification and re-identification of human bodies. Re-identifying persons. The language of personal identity is thus supported by our own actual social conventions, in which the continuity of human life is what represents the continuity of the life of persons, and it is this convention, perhaps, that allows us to follow the reasoning in presentation 2 of the case. Williams himself makes much of this point. Such conventions through language thus provide the kind of non-autonomous axis relation that White is talking about. I take it that for White, given the non-autonomous axis relations would hold contingently, there's no absolute answer to who survives in Williams' case. Relative to our actual circumstances where persons are identified and re-identified on the basis of bodily continuity, it's the A-body person who is A after the process. In Williams' case, White puts it this way: if you're told you'll experience amnesia and be given delusive memories and new personality traits, there's a clear contrast established between the first-person, third-person perspectives on your identity. From the point of view of the people in charge, and by implication the outside world generally, the person with your body remains you in spite of the loss of autonomous access. This is the significance of the fact that people in the story refer to the person who will suffer as you. White claims that the metapsychological relativism provides a more complete understanding of our unstable responses to puzzle cases, in particular Williams' case. I have already disputed this claim in my my claim that psychological reductionists can make sense of this case in both of its descriptions, but simply disagrees with the claims made in presentation 2. So the psychological reductionists can explain away people's positive responses to the survival case. They're simply mistaken about what matters in survival, rather than confused about what are the appropriate criteria. On the other hand, let's suppose for the sake of the argument that White's right, that metapsychological relativism has a more complete account of the discrepancies in our intuitions according to the relativist component of this account. Such intuitions will play a much larger role in resolving questions about survival, in particular where the non-autonomous access relations are concerned. Cross-temporal and cross-cultural differences in such relations would have a crucial role to play in deciding whether a certain case is a case of survival or not. This aspect of the theory, on one interpretation at least, would have quite bizarre and even absurd implications, as we shall see shortly. Given that such absurdities arise, we should find questionable any methodology that interprets the notion of external relations as widely as White does. Consider again Williams' case. As mentioned, White thinks that must think that A survives as the A-body person, roughly because human beings resolve identity questions with reference to bodily continuity. But he must think that a society whose conventions and technological capacities allow the acceptance of body-swapping hypothesis would think that A survives as the B-body person. Notice that this answer relativizes to cultures what we thought was a more universal matter, and that such a move spells trouble. Suppose, for reductio, that there is a society that accepts that question of personal identity really may depend substantially on the non-autonomous access relations. Mentalans became very advanced in its brain sciences. Technology developed to the point where the information from a person's brain could be extracted and placed into the brain of another living human body. Typically, the technology was used in cases where individuals with degenerative brain diseases could have the information in the brain copied into special donors. Those who, for one reason or another, were prepared to have the information of their brains overridden. In such circumstances, such donors might simply have committed suicide. Naturally, the new technology raises troubling legal and bioethical issues. Who is the person resulting from the process, the brain donor or the information donor? After much debate, the Supreme Court, decided that the issue should be resolved by asking those who had an operation the simple question, who are you? In some cases, the question, who do you think you are, was allowed instead. In almost all cases, the answer the court got was equivalent to I am the information donor. In rare cases where the person claimed to be the brain donor, it turned out, almost without exception, the brain donor had been an extremely wealthy person, thus raising some skeptical eyebrows among the bench. Thus, it was decided to change the law. A person's identity was no longer determined by his contingent association with some particular brain and body. It was to be determined psychologically. Interestingly, the mental and Supreme Court has not made its decision retrospective. Prior to the decision, a person's identity was determined by continuity of body and brain. Following the decision is determined by psychological continuity. Who you are really depended on when the Supreme Court decision was made. Of course, the mental lens decision was binding only on mental lens citizens, thus posing some headaches for migration policymakers in similar body lands. Another state with irrelevant technology, a similar Supreme Court decision had gone the other way. Personal identity and body lands depended on the continuity of one's body and brain. Body lands with degenerative brain disease began moving to mental lands for brain copying information or brain copying operations. But once the operations were carried out, they tended to stay in mental lands. Anybody returning to body lands was generally regarded as a persona non grata, a stranger trying to claim something that was not his own. It was even said that those ex-bodylanders crossing the why would they conceivably be treated as a stranger when they think it's bodily based? Anyways, it was even said that for those ex-bodylanders crossing the border, there was the eerie feeling that their very existence depended on which side of the political border they were on. Crossing that line, and that's the end of you. Whatever. The absurdity here depends on particular interpretation of White's view. White would argue, perhaps with some justification, that this conventionalist interpretation is not what he has in mind. Indeed, he does rule out one. Well, before we go there, maybe we put the objection in. Okie dokie. Indeed, he does rule out one form of conventionalism. Metapsychological relativism is not, of course, the facet of conventionalism that claims that one simply decides what is to count as an extension of oneself. One cannot decide that by oneself one means one's body, or alternatively one's psychology, except as a trivial stipulative definition. We cannot decide as individuals what counts as a continuation, any more than we can decide as individuals what kind of society we shall inhabit. But as we collectively determine the form and shape of our society, we also thereby determine the boundaries of ourselves. Now notice first of all that White hereby rejects the conventionalism in which individuals determine the meaning of oneself. Still, my mental land story involves a collective decision concerning how the self is to be understood, but let's grant that White's argument could be expanded to cover this difference, which it clearly can. Anyways, even so, my point is still that we take seriously the idea that the form and shape of a society determines the boundaries of ourselves. This is yet to be shown. What role might the non-autonomous axis relations have that would warrant a belief that they are relevant in the correct egoistic sense? White's only suggestion here is that the perspective of others is a significant, if not the significant, component of our internalized self-image. Other people, real or imagined and internalized, are an important part of our psychological continuity and of our own access to ourselves. It's this internalization of others in virtue of which our society's customs and practices are personal facts about what matters. White's explanations here for how one's environment affects one's identity are plausible enough, but the sense of identity is qualitative identity, surely. More precisely, one's environment or the external features of the non-autonomous axis relations are important to survival, to be sure, but only in the uninteresting sense of shaping one's personality or determining the way in which one is to survive. In White's terms, the non-autonomous axis relations are effective in molding oneself there. So I would certainly take the point that my mental land story would embarrass the metapsychological relativists only on the conventionalist interpretation of the theory. That ought to show that there are many aspects of one's environment, such as the laws of the land, that are simply irrelevant to questions of survival. But if it's agreed that we eliminate such factors as these as relevant to a criterion of personal identity, then it seems to me that the burden of proof now falls on to the metapsychological relativists to explain just how it is possible for the non-autonomous axis relations to inform one's account of the personal identity in the correct way. I think Matthews is still, this is still a counter argument to this thing, at least as I've characterized it, and I think it's worth putting it in. I contend that White will not be able to do this because these relations are not related to survival in the appropriate sense, but they are nonetheless relevant in this sense that shaping one's personality, the non-autonomous relations determine the way in which one survives, and they do this by affecting the character of the contents of the psychological states that feature in survival. It's the character of the psychological content that determines the kind of person one is or will become. So, for example, a war refugee who is forced into a new and strange environment and who then returns home may have to change so drastically that those around her will say she is no longer the same person. But this turn of phrase, not the same person, is used in this context as a well-known colloquialism having nothing to do with the change of identity in the strict sense, but refers to marked qualitative differences, qualitative changes some person has undergone. So this is 73 to 4. I don't know, it's fair, because, you know, White is sort of early in the conventionalist game, I think. White thought the external relation could include non-psychological content and consequently was driven to think that criterion of identity lacking reference to non-autonomous axis relations was somehow like a complete explanation of our intuitive responses to the puzzle cases. This led to a relativism that is unnecessary or best counterintuitive, or so I have argued. One may be led to such a position by conflation of the senses of what matters to survival. If we accept, as White himself does, that for present purposes the relevant sense of the expression is captured by egoistic fear of future pain, and I would add egoistic future-directed fears generally, then many of the beliefs about survival allegedly elicited by certain puzzle cases simply will not arise. I do not, for example, see how mere difference in number in the splitting case is supposed to affect judgments concerning fear of future pain. Still, one may reject the limited sense of what matters in survival described here, but then it seems to me one has changed the subject from the way it's ordinarily talked about. The end.